Hey there. Ever wonder what the US government does with all that money it collects in taxes? Like, does it just keep it in a giant piggy bank shaped like Uncle Sam? Spoiler alert, it's a little more complicated than that. And that complicated part involves something called Treasury bonds. Now, bonds might sound super boring, like something your grandpa snoozes through in the financial section of the newspaper. But trust me, these things are like the hidden gears that make the whole US economic machine tick. Think of the US government as a really, really big household. Like a household with 330 million people and a bazillion things to pay for: roads, schools, the military, you name it. Sometimes, even with all the allowance, taxes, this giant household needs to borrow a little extra cash. And that's where Treasury bonds come in. Imagine the government walks up to you, or a big pension fund, or even another country, and says, "Hey, can we borrow some money?" And to make it worth your while, they promise to pay you back later, with a little extra on top. That's the interest. A Treasury bond is basically that IOU from the US government. It's a way for them to borrow money, and a way for others to invest and earn a bit of interest. Now, why should you, a bright spark of a human being, care about these government IOUs? Well, picture this. That giant government household's financial health. It kind of affects everyone living in the house, right? If the government is borrowing too much or can't pay back its debts, it can create all sorts of problems for the whole economy. Think of it like if your own family racked up a mountain of credit card debt. Suddenly, a big chunk of your family's income goes just to paying off those debts, leaving less money for fun stuff like pizza night or that video game you've been eyeing. Same thing on a national scale. If the government is constantly paying off old debts, it has less money for new investments that could help the economy grow, like building better infrastructure or funding scientific research. Okay, let's bring in our trusty friend, Bob. Bob here is a regular dude, maybe a bit clumsy, but he's trying to understand this stuff too. Imagine Bob decides to lend the government $100 by buying a Treasury bond. The government says, "Thanks, Bob. We'll give you back your $100 in, say, 10 years, and every year we'll also give you $2 in interest." So, Bob becomes a lender to the US government. Now, multiply Bob by millions of people, companies, and even other countries doing the same thing. That's a whole lot of lending going on. And the interest the government pays out on all those bonds? That's a significant chunk of change. If interest rates on these bonds go up, it means the government has to pay more to borrow money. It's like the interest rate on Bob's government IOU suddenly jumps to $5 a year. That extra $3 per bond might not seem like much, but when you multiply it by all those millions of bonds, suddenly, the government is shelling out a lot more in interest payments. Where does that extra money come from? Well, potentially from the same pot of money that could have funded other things. So, higher Treasury bond interest rates can mean the government has less wiggle room in its budget. But wait, there's another side to this coin. Treasury bonds are also considered one of the safest investments out there. Why? Because it's generally assumed that the US government is pretty darn likely to pay back its debts. It's not like your slightly unreliable cousin asking for $20. Because they're so safe, Treasury bonds often act as a benchmark for other interest rates in the economy. Think of them as the anchor tenant in the giant mall of interest rates. If the anchor tenant raises its prices, interest rates, other stores, other types of loans might feel pressure to raise theirs too. So, the interest rate on Treasury bonds can influence things like mortgage rates, car loan rates, and even the interest rates on corporate bonds when big companies borrow money. If Treasury bond rates go up, it can become more expensive for people to buy homes or cars, and for businesses to invest and expand. That can slow down the whole economy. Conversely, if Treasury bond rates are low, borrowing becomes cheaper, which can encourage spending and investment, potentially boosting the economy. See, not so boring after all. These seemingly simple government IOUs have a ripple effect throughout the entire financial system. They're like the heartbeat of the economy, constantly sending signals about the cost of borrowing and the perceived level of risk. And understanding them is key to understanding why certain economic decisions are made and how they might affect your own financial life, even if you're just trying to save up for that new gaming console. But hold on, we've only scratched the surface. There's a whole other layer to this involving something called the Federal Reserve and how they play a role in all this bond business. Yeah, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, as the cool kids call it. Think of the Fed as the central bank of the United States. It's like the grown-up in the room when it comes to the economy, and one of the big tools in their toolbox. You guessed it, Treasury bonds. The Fed buys and sells Treasury bonds in the open market. It's like a giant online auction for government debt. And when they do this, it can have a big impact on those interest rates we were just talking about. Let's bring Bob back. Imagine the Fed decides the economy needs a little boost, like when Bob feels a bit sluggish after too much pizza. One thing the Fed might do is buy a bunch of Treasury bonds from banks and other investors. When the Fed buys these bonds, it's essentially pumping money into the financial system. The banks and investors who sold their bonds now have more cash on hand. And with more cash floating around, the supply of money increases. Think supply and demand. When there's more of something, its price tends to go down. In this case, the price of money is the interest rate. So when the Fed buys Treasury bonds, it can push interest rates down, including the rates on those bonds themselves. Lower Treasury bond rates can then lead to lower rates for mortgages, car loans, and business borrowing, making it cheaper for people and companies to spend and invest, hopefully giving the economy that little kickstart it needed. It's like the Fed giving the economy a cup of strong coffee. Now, what if the economy is starting to feel a little too energetic, like Bob after 3 energy drinks? If inflation, that sneaky thing that makes your dollar buy less stuff over time, starts to become a concern, the Fed might want to cool things down a bit. One way they can do that is by selling Treasury bonds. When the Fed sells bonds, it's taking money out of the financial system. Banks and investors buy those bonds, and their cash reserves decrease. With less money floating around, the supply of money decreases, and the price of money, interest rates, tends to go up. Higher Treasury bond rates can then lead to higher rates across the board, making borrowing more expensive. This can discourage spending and investment, helping to slow down the economy and keep inflation in check. It's like the Fed gently applying the brakes to a speeding car. So the Fed's buying and selling of Treasury bonds is a powerful lever they use to influence interest rates and ultimately, the overall health of the US economy. It's like a delicate dance, constantly trying to find the right balance between stimulating growth and keeping inflation under control. And those Treasury bond rates? They're like the music the economy is dancing to. Everyone, from individual borrowers to big corporations, is paying attention to the rhythm set by these government IOUs. Now you might be thinking, okay, I get that Treasury bonds are important for borrowing and interest rates, but how does that directly affect my life? Well, think about it. If mortgage rates go down because Treasury bond rates are low, maybe your family can afford a bigger house, or refinance your current one and save some money each month. If car loan rates are lower, that new ride you've been dreaming about becomes a little more affordable. If businesses can borrow money cheaply, they might be more likely to invest in new equipment, hire more people, and maybe even give out bigger raises. On the flip side, if Treasury bond rates go up and borrowing becomes more expensive, those big purchases might get put on hold. And if businesses face higher borrowing costs, they might be less likely to expand or hire. So, even though you might not be buying and selling Treasury bonds yourself, their influence trickles down and touches your financial life in many ways, big and small. They're like the invisible strings pulling on different parts of the economy. And understanding those strings helps you understand why things cost what they do, and why the economy sometimes speeds up and sometimes slows down. So, in conclusion, Treasury bonds, those seemingly simple government IOUs, are way more than just pieces of paper. They're a fundamental tool the US government uses to borrow money and manage its finances, kind of like how your family might use a credit card responsibly, hopefully. More importantly, the interest rates on these bonds act as a crucial benchmark, influencing borrowing costs across the entire economy, from mortgages to business loans. And the Federal Reserve's buying and selling of these bonds is a key way they try to steer the economy towards stable growth and low inflation. So, even if you're just trying to figure out if you can afford that new phone, understanding Treasury bonds gives you a peek behind the curtain at the big financial forces shaping your world. If you want me to make other videos explaining these topics, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.